Hello all you freedom-loving people. Welcome to another episode of Front Page. I'm your host, Scott Goulet. Canada is the second largest country by total land area. Its advanced economy is the 10th largest in the world, and its federal election has entered the final critical period. The result of Canada's election will impact the world heavily. The ruling Liberal Party, led by Justin Trudeau, has always led in the polls, but in the last week it has seen its support drop and has instead been overtaken by the Conservatives. So what's causing Justin Trudeau's slide in the polls? Okay, let's get into it. According to the latest data released by Canadian pollster Nanos Research on Saturday, after 3 days of campaigning last week, the Liberal Party's voting support had dropped to 30.8%, while the Conservatives' support rose to 33%. For the first time in 18 months, the Conservatives overtook the ruling Liberals. Canada's third party, the New Democratic Party, or NDP, also rose to 20.1% in the polls, up from 19.4% on August 23rd. Nick Nanos, founder and chief data scientist at Nanos Research, told CTV on Saturday that Friday night was very bad for the Liberals, whose support dropped by more than 2 percentage points in one day. The Liberals are certainly under negative pressure now that the Conservatives appear to have the upper hand compared to the tie earlier in the week. The two major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, started last week in a neck-and-neck position, with the Liberals at 32.5% and the Conservatives at 31.4%, a difference of only 1.1 percentage points. The gap between Trudeau's approval rating as preferred Prime Minister and that of Conservative leader Erin O'Toole continues to narrow as well. According to Nanos Research, O'Toole's approval rating rose to 27.2% from 24% from the beginning of the week, while Trudeau's approval rating dropped to 29.9% from 32.7%. Why did Justin Trudeau suddenly become the underdog? Last week's crisis in Afghanistan has certainly affected the image of leaders in Western countries. On the U.S. side, the Biden administration's approval ratings have plummeted. The latest Pew poll found that 42% of respondents said the Biden administration is doing a poor job of handling the situation in Afghanistan. A recent Echelon Insights poll also showed that most people disapproved of the way Biden is handling Afghanistan. Some critics are concerned about Biden's ability to do his job. An August 24th CNBC poll noted that Biden's average approval rating is 47%, down 7 points from May, and the lowest rating since he took office. Canada's governing party is no exception. Canada's slow and under-resourced evacuation operations in Afghanistan have resulted in some Afghans who have turned to Canada for help not receiving the help they deserve. This is one of the reasons for the public's dissatisfaction with the ruling party. National Post reporter Tyler Dawson documented how thousands of Canadian allies fell into the hands of the Taliban because of mistakes made by Canadian officials during the evacuation. Andrew Rusk, an Afghan interpreter and member of Not Left Behind, said Canada had 4.5 months to do the right thing, but only one plane landed on the ground in early August. Journalist Kevin Newman reported on a tragic incident. During an evacuation from Afghanistan, Canadian officials told a family of Afghan allies to put on red clothes and wait for them at a gas station near Kabul airport. No Canadian representative showed up, and 2 days later, exhausted and dehydrated, the people had to abandon the escape attempt. The family consists of about 10 people. Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marc Garneau, on Sunday, August 29th, accepted public criticism of the withdrawal and said that no one could have predicted Afghanistan falling to the Taliban at such a rapid pace. Garneau told CTV News, "We accept the criticism and we're trying to deal with the situation." In mid-August, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called for an early election for September 20th. The turmoil in Afghanistan was not expected. According to Trudeau, the reason for the early election was that he needed a new mandate to ensure voters' approval of his Liberal government's plan to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. When Trudeau announced the election, Reuters said that his move was a gamble. The article reads, Trudeau, 49, is betting that high vaccination rates against the virus and a post-pandemic economic rebound will help him prolong and strengthen his grip on power. At the time, polls showed the Liberals would win their third consecutive election, though they may not gain a majority in the 338-seat House of Commons. A Legger marketing poll released on August 12th showed that nationally, the Liberals would win 35% of the vote, while the main opposition, the Conservatives, would get 30%, and that the left-leaning NDP would get 19%. In response to the pandemic, the Liberals have spent heavily to subsidize businesses and individuals. These initiatives will win votes for the ruling party in the short term, but the spending also makes Canada's national debt and budget deficit reach record highs, which will have a negative impact on the economy in the long run. The actual reason for Trudeau requesting an early election is that he is trying to avoid the dilemma of facing an economic downturn if they were to have the election in 2 years rather than now. Last month, the Bank of Canada made an upbeat forecast for growth prospects for the rest of the year, but debt markets are already signaling a possible slowdown in Canada's economic growth. The Conservatives and New Democrats have thus denounced the idea of an early election, calling it a power grab. The Conservatives say if Trudeau wins again, spending will rise, leaving generations of Canadians weighed down by the debt. Canada's high vaccination rate is an achievement that the Trudeau government is proud of. Newly released data show 71% of the country's eligible population is fully vaccinated. But the government's overpromotion of vaccines and even its vaccine passport policies have drawn criticism. Some Conservative MPs have described the government's push for mandatory vaccination as authoritarian. As more and more government agencies and private companies announce mandatory vaccination policies, opposition from the private sector is growing. Over the weekend, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's campaign rally in Bolton, Ontario was cancelled for security reasons after protesters demonstrated against it. In fact, this is not the first time that Canadian protesters have protested against measures pushed by the Trudeau government. Since Trudeau began his election campaign, many have been outraged by his push for mandatory vaccination-related policies. On August 14th, tens of thousands of people took to downtown Montreal to oppose the Quebec government's implementation of a vaccine passport. On August 28th, hundreds of protesters marched along major streets in Toronto chanting "No vaccine passports." Slogans seen at the march included "Mandatory vaccinations are wrong" and "Trust me to make the best choice for myself." On the same day, thousands of people gathered again in Montreal and marched downtown to protest the government's upcoming vaccine policy. Legal experts say that the Trudeau government will face legal challenges to mandatory vaccinations. Lior Samfiru, a Toronto employment lawyer, said that employees affected by mandatory vaccinations could take legal action and would have a good chance of winning. Mandating a medical procedure and treating vaccinated and unvaccinated employees separately may violate human rights. In addition to the pandemic, Canada's China policy has also become an election issue. Huawei's chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou's extradition proceedings has caused tensions between China and Canada. Over the past 2 years, the Conservative Party has taken a tough stance on China, accusing the Trudeau government of only paying lip service without substantive action. For example, it has been slow to sanction China or ban Huawei's participation in 5G construction. This criticism is hard for Trudeau to refute. On the 10th day after Meng's arrest in Canada back in December of 2018, Beijing arrested 2 Canadians in China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. The CCP held the 2 Michaels hostage and demanded that the Canadian government refuse to extradite Meng to the U.S. Recently, as Meng's extradition case reached its final stage, a Chinese court commuted the 15-year sentence of Canadian citizen Robert Schellenberg to a death sentence. The Chinese court also sentenced Michael Spavor to 11 years in prison for espionage. While Trudeau has insisted that he will not interfere with judicial independence, he has also protested against the Chinese Communist Party's hostage diplomacy. However, it is true that there are no more concrete and substantial countermeasures. Even Canadian embassy personnel in China have been unable to visit the 2 Canadians in detention, and it appears that Trudeau is powerless to control the situation in dealing with the rogue Chinese regime. Canada and China have deep trade ties, but how to strike a balance between China's treatment of Falun Gong practitioners and the people of Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, which are human rights issues that conflict with Canadian values, is a question politicians must face. Of course, it is not Trudeau alone who is to blame for the softness towards the Chinese Communist Party. This is not the first time that the CCP has violated Canadians at will. Canada has been passive-aggressive in dealing with the CCP's brutality in the past. Back in 2014, China suddenly and secretly imprisoned the Canadian couple, Julia and Kevin Garrett, in retaliation for Canada's detention of a Chinese tycoon named Su Bin. Su Bin had joined forces with Chinese communist hackers to steal military aircraft designs from the Pentagon. He was extradited from Canada to the United States, where he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years and 10 months in prison. In 2006, another Canadian citizen, Hussein Khan Salil, a Uyghur, was arrested in Uzbekistan, and despite the Canadian government's opposition to his extradition from Uzbekistan to China, he was extradited back to Xinjiang and sentenced to life in prison on false terrorism charges. The Canadian government has only verbally protested and opposed China's actions without taking substantial action. China has been using hostage diplomacy with impunity. In addition, the depth of the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration in Canadian society is staggering. On June 24, 2020, news broke that 19 Canadian politicians had written a letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau requesting that the Hmong extradition hearing be shelved. They argued that this is the only way to rescue the two Michaels detained in China. The co-signers included former MPs, former Supreme Court justices, former foreign ministers, and former ambassadors to the U.S., among other prominent Canadian dignitaries. The leverage that the CCP tries to exert over foreign countries knows no bounds. It is more important for Canadians to have a clear understanding of the CCP than who was elected as the next Prime Minister. In the United States, for example, anti-communism has become a popular and bipartisan consensus, and whoever is president should not stray too far from the issue. Some people argue that Canada is not as strong as the U.S. in both economic and military terms, and it is dependent on China as a market. So it is more difficult to be tough with the Chinese Communist Party. We can look at how Australia, which is in a similar situation to Canada, is handling its conflict with the CCP. Australia is 1/5 the size of Canada and has 10 million fewer people than Canada. Its economic status is lesser than that of Canada, and in its geopolitical environment, Australia is much closer to China, more economically dependent on China, and more infiltrated by the CCP. However, Australia was one of the first countries to become more vigilant and to counteract the Chinese government's foreign infiltration. In 2018, the Australian Parliament introduced legislation to punish foreign interference crimes. It banned political parties from accepting foreign donations, and it required foreign political organizations or entities to be registered in order to lobby. The Communist Party's United Front was directly challenged as a result. In April of 2020, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called on the international community to launch an independent investigation into the source of the COVID-19 virus. The Aussies also banned Huawei from participating in the construction of 5G networks on national security grounds back in 2018. Unsurprisingly, Beijing struck back within months of the Australian Prime Minister's call for the virus origin investigation. China began an anti-dumping investigation into Australian wine. The CCP announced high tariffs on Australian wine and restrictions on imports of Australian beef, barley, and coal, with obvious political aims, but the Australians did not give in. In July, Australian Trade Minister Dan Tehan said in an interview that Australia was prepared to take the economic hit of China's trade blockade in order to defend its sovereignty. Tehan said, "In the end, our values are so important to us, and we think that there's something that we have to protect above all else." He added, "If we have to pay an economic price for that, that's something that we are prepared to pay." Matt Pottinger, former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, published an article in the September issue of Foreign Affairs magazine that was titled, "Beijing's American Hustle: How Chinese Grand Strategy Exploits U.S. Power," and talks about the essence of China's economic sanctions against Australia. Pottinger pointed out, CCP leaders gambled that Australian businesses suffering from a targeted trade embargo would lobby their government to make political concessions to Beijing, but the Australian people, business leaders and exporters included, understood that accepting China's ultimatum would mean submitting to a dangerous new order. Australian businesses absorbed the losses. They weathered the embargo and found new markets. Australians decided that their sovereignty was more important than lobster sales, no doubt confounding those in Beijing who had assumed that Canberra would put Australia's economic interests ahead of its foundational values. Australians have not only found new export customers for their lobster and wine, even more miraculous, iron ore prices on the international market have soared to a decade high this year. Australia accounts for more than half of global iron ore exports. The price of iron ore on the international market was less than $100 per ton last spring, but rose to $188 per ton on April 20th of this year. As a result, Australia's trade revenue rose. In May, the price of iron ore in Australia rose further to $233 per ton, as demand of iron ore from Chinese steel companies was very strong. Meanwhile, exports from Brazil, the second largest exporter of iron ore, were severely hampered by the pandemic and bad weather. Pottinger's article pointed out, if the contest is based on interests, tyranny wins. If the contest is based on values, democracy wins. The example of Australia demonstrates this nicely. On the contrary, Hollywood is basically doing the opposite of Australia, and it is therefore suffering. This is another lesson we can learn from. Yesterday, we published an in-depth report on our membership site about Hollywood. I want to show you the trailer. In 2020, the Chinese film market topped the global box office with $3.1 billion, 35% higher than the North American market with $2.2 billion. But this huge market has little to do with Hollywood, with American films accounting for less than 10% of the total. None of the top 10 films at the Chinese box office were produced by Hollywood either. This is a huge blow to American producers who have been carefully managing the Chinese market for the past decade or so. Why did Hollywood movies lose their appeal overnight? To answer this question, we have to start with the efforts made by Hollywood to penetrate the Chinese market. In this exclusive episode of Front Page, we dive into how Hollywood has been playing by the CCP's rules and how that might just backfire on them. Watch the full episode on frontpageshow.com. Okay, this is our show for today. Thank you for tuning in. Again, if you like what you heard, please don't forget to like and subscribe this video and share it with at least one of your friends, because everybody deserves to know the truth. Again, thank you for watching Front Page, and we will see you next time.